The cold air nipped at Dana Wells's face as she stepped out of the grocery store, a simple bag of groceries in hand. For her, this was supposed to be just another uneventful moment in a busy life. Grocery shopping was a mundane task, yet it offered her a brief escape from the relentless pressures of her work. As a police captain, the hum of daily life, shoppers chatting, the sound of cash registers, provided her with rare moments of peace, time to think about anything other than the weight she carried as one of the department's most respected officers. In her casual gray sweatshirt and dark jeans, she blended into the sea of people on the street, a face like any other. Her badge and gun, normally visible and authoritative, were tucked away in her purse, concealed beneath her arm. Today she wasn't Captain Dana Wells, leader of officers and strategist against crime. She was simply Dana, someone picking up groceries for a quiet night at home. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her partner, Emma. "Hey, when will you be home?" With a slight smile, Dana quickly typed back, "On my way, just grab some groceries. See you soon." As she turned onto Maple Street, just a couple blocks from her apartment, everything felt so normal. Cyclists zipped past her, and a group of teenagers were laughing loudly as they walked by, their voices full of carefree joy. Dana appreciated these small glimpses of life, moments that reminded her why she took on the responsibility of her job in the first place. She lived for these peaceful, simple scenes where everyone felt safe. But just 2 blocks away, Officer Greg Mathers sat in his squad car, his nerves prickling with impatience. The day had been slow, too slow for his liking. Minor traffic stops and noise complaints hadn't done much to quiet the restless energy he felt in his bones. Greg was young, eager, and overly confident. He had joined the police force to make a difference, to be in the middle of the action, to chase down suspects and feel the thrill of making an arrest. The crackle of the radio broke the silence in his squad car, and Greg's pulse quickened. "Dispatch to all units, 1031 in progress. Robbery suspect, black female, mid-30s, wearing dark jeans and a gray sweatshirt. Last seen heading west on 5th and Maple." The description fit so well in his mind. Greg's adrenaline surged. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He grabbed the radio and responded, "Unit 34, copy that. Heading toward 5th and Maple." As Dana walked, completely unaware of the scene about to unfold, Greg was already rounding the corner onto Maple. His heart pounded as his eyes scanned the street. And then he saw her, a black woman, mid-30s, wearing a gray sweatshirt and dark jeans, walking with a grocery bag slung over her shoulder. Without a second thought, Greg's instincts kicked in. This was her. She matched the description perfectly. He pulled his squad car to the curb, his eyes never leaving her as she casually made her way down the sidewalk, oblivious to the tension building behind her. Greg stepped out of the car, his voice cutting through the cool air. "Ma'am, stop right there." Dana froze, confusion washing over her. She blinked against the harsh light of the police car's headlights, which now felt like 2 spotlights glaring at her. Slowly, she turned to face the officer. Her mind raced. Was he talking to her? Why? What had she done wrong? "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but cautious. The confusion was clear in her tone. Her instincts as a police officer told her that something was off, but her immediate thought was that this had to be a misunderstanding. She had done nothing wrong. Greg, however, wasn't interested in explanations. His hand hovered near his holstered gun, and his posture screamed readiness. "Hands where I can see them." His voice was sharp, commanding, leaving no room for questions. Dana's heart raced. As an officer herself, she had been in situations like this before, but she had never imagined being on the receiving end of it. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began, her voice level, though there was a growing edge of frustration. But Greg wasn't hearing her. His mind was locked into the description from the dispatch. All he could see was what he believed to be a robbery suspect, standing right in front of him, trying to talk her way out of an arrest. The tension in his body was undeniable. "I said, hands where I can see them, now." Dana took a breath, her voice growing firmer as she spoke again. "I'm a police officer. I'm Captain Dana Wells, from the 4th Precinct. You've made a mistake." But in Greg's mind, it wasn't a mistake. It was a narrative he had seen play out before. He had heard this story countless times. People pretending to be someone they weren't, trying to get out of trouble. His grip tightened on his holstered gun as he stepped closer. He didn't hear her words. He didn't even process the truth she was telling him. Before Dana could react, Greg was on her, grabbing her arm and roughly spinning her around. Her grocery bag hit the ground, its contents spilling across the sidewalk. The cold steel of the handcuffs clamped around her wrists, and in that moment, the world seemed to stop. Her badge and gun lay forgotten in her purse, which had tumbled to the ground in the chaos. "Officer, this is a mistake." Dana's voice grew louder now, her frustration boiling over. "I'm Captain Dana Wells. I'm with the police department. You've got the wrong person." But Greg's tunnel vision had taken over. The training he had relied on told him to remain in control, to assume the worst-case scenario. He wasn't listening. He was acting. He was making an arrest, just like he had imagined in his head. With a firm grip, he led Dana to the back of his squad car, ignoring the groceries scattered across the sidewalk, ignoring her protests, and ignoring the sinking feeling deep in Dana's chest. The world around them began to notice. People stopped, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. To the crowd, this looked like just another arrest. A black woman being taken into custody by a white cop. Another scene that, to them, was all too familiar. But for Dana, this wasn't just an arrest. It was a betrayal, a violation of everything she had worked for, everything she believed in. As Greg closed the door of the squad car, his radio crackled again. "Suspect in custody," he said, his voice steady, confident. And just like that, Captain Dana Wells, one of the highest-ranking officers in the city, was reduced to nothing more than a suspect, handcuffed in the backseat of a squad car. Dana Wells sat in the back of the squad car, her wrists still stinging from the handcuffs that had been forcefully placed on her moments ago. The city's lights blurred outside the window as the car sped through the streets, the siren's faint wail, a distant reminder of the situation she found herself in. Inside the car, her mind raced through a storm of emotions. How could this have happened? How could she, a captain, a high-ranking officer who had given years of her life to this department, now sit here, treated like a common criminal by one of her own officers? She shifted slightly, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her skin, a stinging reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. Every fiber of her being wanted to shout, to demand that Officer Greg Mathers see reason, see his mistake, but she knew better. The anger boiled in her chest, and yet she sat in stunned silence. Her mind swirled with disbelief and outrage. How could this happen to her? Someone who had spent her career fighting for fairness, for integrity within the police force? How many others had been treated like this, without the badge and authority she had? Her thoughts shifted to Greg. Had he even thought before acting? Had he considered even for a second that the woman in front of him might not be the suspect? No. In that moment, he hadn't seen Captain Dana Wells. He had seen a black woman, a vague description in a radio dispatch, and he had acted without question. That was the part that stung the most. Not just the handcuffs, not just the humiliation, but the knowledge that she, too, was reduced to a stereotype in his eyes. As the squad car pulled into the precinct, her heart sank further. The headlights illuminated the familiar building, but tonight it felt foreign. This was supposed to be her sanctuary, her place of work, and now she would be led inside in cuffs, in front of her colleagues, as if she had done something wrong. Her stomach churned with the thought. How many of her fellow officers would witness this? How many would whisper and speculate? She had worked too hard to build her reputation, to be respected in a department where her identity had always set her apart. Now that reputation was crumbling before her eyes. Greg Mathers, on the other hand, was buzzing with a mix of adrenaline and doubt. He had been so sure, so confident in the moment. The description from the dispatch had been clear: a black female, mid-30s, wearing dark jeans and a gray sweatshirt. He had seen Dana, and it had all fit perfectly. He had done his job, or so he thought. But as the car pulled up to the precinct, something gnawed at him. His earlier certainty had been replaced by a creeping discomfort. He replayed the arrest in his mind, Dana's calm insistence that she was a police captain, her steady voice telling him over and over again that there had been a mistake. And yet, he hadn't listened. Could she really have been telling the truth? Could he have just handcuffed one of his superiors? The possibility now hung over him like a shadow. "Get out," Greg muttered as he opened the door, his voice still authoritative, but now tinged with uncertainty. Dana stepped out, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead. She was done trying to reason with him. Her anger simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. "Officer Mathers, I need you to listen to me," Dana began, her voice low but fierce. "I am Captain Dana Wells, 4th Precinct. You've arrested the wrong person." But Greg wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. The doubt was there, clawing at him, but he couldn't let go of the narrative he had built in his head. People lied to get out of trouble all the time. He had seen it more times than he could count. This situation couldn't be any different, or at least, that's what he kept telling himself. "Let's go," he muttered, gesturing toward the entrance of the precinct. Dana clenched her jaw, holding back the fire of frustration that was building inside her, and walked ahead of him. As they entered the station, the usual noise of officers talking, phones ringing, and papers shuffling seemed to fade into the background. One by one, heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence, and all eyes locked onto Dana. The room fell into a hushed silence. Everyone knew Captain Dana Wells. She wasn't just another officer. She was a leader, someone deeply respected for her work, her intelligence, and her fairness. To see her in handcuffs, being led in like a criminal, sent shockwaves through the precinct. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Was this a mistake? What had happened? Sergeant Maria Lopez, sitting at her desk, saw the commotion and immediately stood up, her face going pale. She hurried toward the entrance, her eyes widening in disbelief as she caught sight of Dana. "Captain Wells?" she gasped, looking between Dana and Greg. "What's going on here?" Before Greg could open his mouth, Dana spoke, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Officer Mathers here arrested me, under the assumption that I'm a robbery suspect," she said, her tone sharp and controlled, despite me telling him repeatedly who I am. Lopez's face flushed with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. She looked at Greg, her brows furrowing. "Mathers, is this true?" Her voice was stern, demanding an answer. Greg's face had lost all its earlier confidence. His mouth went dry as he tried to explain himself. I didn't realize. She matched the description. I thought I was doing the right thing." His voice trailed off, weak and unconvincing. "You didn't realize?" Dana's voice, normally composed and diplomatic, now had an edge of disbelief and frustration. "You didn't even check my ID. I told you multiple times who I was, but you didn't listen. You assumed because I matched some vague description, I was guilty." Greg swallowed hard, his head spinning. The certainty he had felt on the street was gone. All that was left was a sinking realization of just how badly he had messed up. He had ignored her, dismissed her words, and now he was standing in front of his captain, with no defense for his actions. Lopez fumbled with her keys, unlocking the handcuffs that had bound Dana. The metal clinked loudly in the now silent room, a sound that felt like a release of all the tension that had built up around them. Dana rubbed her wrists, the red marks left by the cuffs a painful reminder of the indignity she had just suffered. "Captain," Lopez said softly, her voice filled with regret. "I am so sorry. We'll get this sorted out right away." But Dana didn't respond immediately. She took a moment to breathe, to let the weight of everything sink in. Finally she spoke, her voice low but steady. "This isn't just about a mistake, Sergeant. This is about bias. It's about the fact that one of our officers didn't even stop to consider that a black woman in a sweatshirt, could be anything other than a criminal. Lopez flinched, the truth of Dana's words hitting hard. She knew what Dana was saying wasn't just about tonight. It was about something much deeper, something systemic. And this moment, this arrest, was about to send shockwaves through the department. Greg stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had arrested his captain, a woman who had worked to improve the very department he served, and he had done it because he hadn't questioned his own assumptions. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing down as the enormity of his mistake fully hit him. Sergeant Lopez led Dana into her office, closing the door behind them, leaving Greg standing in the middle of the precinct under the weight of all the eyes still on him. Whispers had started, and Greg could feel the humiliation creeping up on him. Every officer in the room knew what had just happened, and soon the entire precinct would know. Inside the office, Dana sat down, her mind still racing. Lopez stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of what to say or do. "Captain, again, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice quiet. "I had no idea this was happening." Dana sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's not just about me, Maria. It's about what this says about our department. This isn't just a one-off mistake. This is a symptom of something much bigger." Lopez nodded, biting her lip. She knew exactly what Dana was talking about, the biases that influence decisions, the assumptions that were made without a second thought. "I'll start the internal review process immediately," Lopez said, her voice filled with resolve. "This will be thoroughly investigated." Dana appreciated the gesture, but she knew that wasn't enough. An investigation into Greg's actions wouldn't fix the deeper problem. "We need more than an investigation, Maria. This department has been ignoring these issues for too long." Lopez met Dana's gaze, understanding the gravity of her words. "I'll speak with the chief," Lopez said. "We'll make sure this is handled properly." But Dana wasn't done. "This needs to be more than just a disciplinary action. We need to address the culture here. This can't happen again. Not to me, and not to anyone else." Lopez nodded again, her face serious. She knew that Dana was right. What had happened tonight wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about a system that had allowed that mistake to happen. As Lopez left the office, Dana leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She had spent years trying to change the department from within, pushing for reforms that would prevent exactly what had just happened to her. But now she realized those reforms couldn't wait. They were needed more urgently than ever. Dana sat in her office, her mind still reeling from the events of the last hour. The room felt colder than usual. The once familiar walls of the precinct now seemed foreign, as if she no longer belonged there. Her wrists still throbbed from the too tight handcuffs, and the emotional sting of the incident refused to fade. She had always known the systemic issues within the department, the biases, the judgments, the assumptions. But today, those issues had been laid bare in a way she had never expected. She was a captain, someone who had given her heart and soul to reforming this department from the inside. And yet, none of that had mattered in that moment on the street when Greg Mathers saw only a suspect, not a captain, not a fellow officer, not a person. He had seen her as a threat, and that reality cut deeper than any physical wound. A soft knock on her office door broke her from her thoughts. It was Sergeant Maria Lopez, her expression a mix of concern and embarrassment. Dana motioned for her to enter, though her own emotions were still simmering under the surface. "Captain, I just spoke with the chief," Lopez began, closing the door behind her. "He's aware of the situation, and he wants to meet with you as soon as possible." Dana nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was ready for that conversation yet. She knew what the chief would say, the same reassurances, the same promises that had been made time and time again. But none of it seemed to change anything. "What about Mathers?" Dana asked, her voice steady but firm. Lopez's face tightened at the question. "He's in the locker room right now, completely shaken up. He knows he made a mistake." "Mistake?" Dana repeated, her eyes narrowing. "Maria, this isn't just about a mistake. This is about judgment, bias, and the culture we've been trying to change for years. He didn't even stop to think. He didn't question himself for a second. Lopez lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the truth of Dana's words. "I know, Captain, I know. The chief is going to handle it." Dana let out a slow breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew Mathers wasn't the only one at fault. He was a product of a system that had failed to teach its officers how to see beyond their assumptions, beyond their ingrained biases. But knowing that didn't make the situation any less painful. "Tell the chief I'll meet with him in 15 minutes, Dana finally said, her voice calm but resolute. Lopez nodded and quietly left the room, leaving Dana alone with her thoughts once more. She stared at the papers on her desk, reports she had been working on just that morning, before everything had spiraled out of control. Her heart ached with frustration, anger, and a sense of betrayal. How could she continue to lead this department if this was the reality she had to face every day? 15 minutes later, Dana walked into Chief Henry Marshall's office, her shoulders squared, her expression unreadable. Marshall, a tall man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood behind his desk, his face etched with concern. He had been the chief for over a decade, and while Dana respected him, she also knew that he represented the old guard, a system that was resistant to change. "Dana," he said as she entered, his voice gruff but soft with sympathy, "please have a seat." Dana sat, her eyes never leaving his. "Chief, I'm sure you know what happened." Marshall sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I do. And I'm deeply sorry for what you went through. It should never have happened." Dana leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "It did happen. And the fact that it happened speaks volumes about the state of this department." Marshall nodded, his face grim. "I agree. We've been making progress, but clearly, there's more work to be done." "More work to be done?" Dana's voice rose slightly, unable to contain her frustration. "Chief, this is more than just needing a little more work. This is a systemic problem. I'm a captain, and one of my own officers arrested me because he saw me as a suspect first. What does that say about how he treats civilians? What does that say about the culture we've been fostering here?" Marshall leaned back in his chair, his expression tight. "I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. Officer Mathers will face disciplinary action, and we're going to conduct a full internal review." But Dana wasn't satisfied with that answer. Disciplinary action isn't enough. This is about more than just one officer's mistake. This is about how we train our officers, how we address bias, how we hold ourselves accountable. This is about the fact that this department is still struggling to see people as individuals, not just threats. The chief's face hardened slightly. "I understand that, Dana, but we can't overhaul everything overnight. We have to be strategic about this." Dana shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "Strategic? Chief, we've been strategic for years, and look where it's gotten us. If we don't address this head-on, if we don't start making real, meaningful changes, then we're just going to keep finding ourselves in this same position. And next time, it might not be me. It might be someone who doesn't have a badge to defend themselves." The room fell silent, the weight of Dana's words hanging in the air. Chief Marshall sighed again, rubbing his temples as if trying to stave off a headache. "What do you want me to do, Dana?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Tell me what you think needs to happen." Dana didn't hesitate. "I want a full review of our training programs, starting with how we address racial bias and de-escalation. I want mandatory bias training for every officer, no exceptions, and I want a commitment from this department that we're going to start holding people accountable for these kinds of actions, not just sweeping them under the rug." Marshall was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing her words. Finally, he nodded. "I'll support you on this. I'll make sure the mayor knows where we stand." Dana's gaze softened slightly, though the fire in her voice remained. "This can't be another promise, Chief. It has to be action." Marshall stood, extending his hand. "You have my word, Captain." Dana shook his hand, though the unease in her chest remained. Words were easy, but she had been in this position too many times before. The real test would be in the days and weeks to come. As she left the chief's office, Dana felt the weight of the situation settle even deeper into her bones. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire department, about the community they were supposed to serve, and about a system that was still failing too many people. And she wasn't sure if she had the strength to fight this battle alone. Back in her office, Dana's phone buzzed. It was a message from her partner, Emma. "How are you holding up? I heard what happened." Dana stared at the message for a moment before typing back a quick reply. Dana sat in her office, still reeling from the incident. The sting of the handcuffs had faded from her wrists, but the emotional weight of what had happened had only deepened. The precinct felt foreign, like a place she no longer recognized. Her colleagues moved around her in hushed tones, unsure of what to say, how to act. The whispers had already started, rumors circulating faster than she could even process the enormity of the situation. How had it come to this? How had one of her own officers, a man she had crossed paths with before, arrested her in such a humiliating way? The answer lingered in her mind, one that was as painful as it was familiar. Bias, prejudice. The very things she had been fighting to root out of the department for years had now come crashing down on her. She was no longer just a witness to the problem, she had become its victim. Sergeant Lopez knocked on her door softly before stepping inside. Her face was still flushed with embarrassment, and Dana could see the discomfort in her eyes. "Captain," Lopez began, her voice tentative, "I've started the internal review process. Officer Mathers will be interviewed, and the department is launching an investigation into the incident." Dana nodded, her eyes fixed on a distant point in the room. She knew this process all too well. Investigations, internal reviews. These were the formalities that followed incidents like this, but they rarely led to real change. It was all procedural, all too often a way to sweep mistakes under the rug, to shift the blame without addressing the underlying issues. "That's a start," Dana replied, her voice steady but devoid of enthusiasm. "But it's not enough, Maria. This can't just be about punishing one officer. This is about the entire system that allows things like this to happen." Lopez sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "I know, Captain, but we've got to follow the procedures. The chief is also calling for a meeting later today to discuss the public response. The video of your arrest. It's already circulating online." Dana closed her eyes briefly, the weight of that revelation settling in. She had suspected as much. In today's world, nothing stayed private for long. She could already picture the headlines, the public reaction. A black female police captain, wrongfully arrested by her own officer. It was a story that would ignite fierce debate, one that would stir outrage and demands for accountability. And yet, Dana knew, the narrative would be shaped not by the truth, but by the angles and perceptions that dominated social media and the news. "Let the chief know I'll be there," Dana said, opening her eyes and standing up. She walked over to the window, staring out at the precinct parking lot. Her mind was already moving ahead, thinking about how she needed to handle this, how the department needed to respond. Lopez shifted uncomfortably by the door. "Captain, I just want you to know that I'm sorry this happened. I don't know what to say. It's just wrong." Dana turned to face her, her expression softening slightly. "I know, Maria, and I appreciate that. But we need to do more than just feel sorry. We need to act." Lopez nodded, understanding the gravity of Dana's words. With a final look of regret, she left the office, leaving Dana alone with her thoughts. The meeting with Chief Henry Marshall later that day was tense. Dana sat across from the chief, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Marshall, an older man with decades of service behind him, looked worn and tired, the weight of his position heavy on his shoulders. "We've got a problem, Dana," he said bluntly, leaning back in his chair. "The video of your arrest is already going viral. People are outraged. The mayor's office is calling for immediate action, and the department is in damage control mode." Dana met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "This isn't just about PR, Chief. This is about how one of our own officers acted on his biases and humiliated me in the street. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." Marshall sighed, rubbing his temples. I know. But the department is under a lot of pressure right now. The last thing we need is a scandal that could undermine everything we've been working for. I need you to help me navigate this, Dana." Dana felt a surge of anger rise up in her chest. Navigate this? Was that all this was to him? A situation to be managed? A story to be controlled? Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath her words. "Chief, this isn't about managing a situation. This is about holding people accountable, starting with Officer Mathers. What happened to me is symptomatic of a much larger issue, one we've been sweeping under the rug for years. It's time we address it." Marshall frowned, leaning forward slightly. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't seen the problems with my own eyes? But we have to be careful here. The department can't afford to lose the trust of the public." Dana shook her head, her voice firm. "We've already lost the trust of the public. Incidents like this are exactly why people don't trust us. If we don't confront it head-on, if we try to downplay this, we're only making it worse." The room fell into a heavy silence. Marshall studied her, his eyes betraying a hint of frustration, but also understanding. He knew Dana was right, even if he didn't want to admit it. "What do you suggest we do then?" he asked, his voice softer now. Dana took a breath, steadying herself. "We start by being transparent. We need to issue a public statement acknowledging what happened, and we need to make it clear that we're taking this seriously. No spin, no excuses, just the truth. And then we need to follow through with real action. We can't just punish one officer and call it a day. This is about systemic reform, starting with bias training for every officer on the force." Marshall's expression darkened at the mention of reform. "Bias training? You know how resistant the rank and file are to those kinds of changes, Dana. They see it as an attack on their professionalism." Dana stood firm. "Then it's time they understand that this isn't an attack. It's about making sure we're doing our jobs right. If they can't accept that, then maybe they shouldn't be wearing the badge." Another silence followed, this one more charged. Marshall leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he considered her words. Finally, he sighed. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll make the statement, and I'll push for the training. But you're going to have to be the face of this, Dana. You're the one the public will listen to, and I need you to tread carefully. The union is already on edge, and they're not going to take kindly to more scrutiny." Dana nodded, her mind already spinning with the next steps. "I'll handle it, Chief. But understand this. If we don't do this right, if we don't take real action, we're going to be dealing with a lot more than just bad PR." Marshall gave her a long, measured look before nodding. "All right, Dana. Let's get to work." The days that followed were a blur of meetings, media briefings, and tense discussions within the department. The video of Dana's arrest had spread like wildfire, sparking protests outside the precinct. The public was demanding accountability, and Dana found herself at the center of the storm. She stood in front of the cameras, addressing the media with a calm but resolute demeanor. "What happened to me was not just a mistake," she said, her voice firm. "It was a reflection of a larger problem within law enforcement. A problem we cannot ignore any longer. I'm committed to ensuring that this department confronts its biases and takes real steps toward reform." The statement was received with mixed reactions. Some praised Dana for her courage and her call for change. Others, particularly from within the police ranks, saw it as a betrayal, a captain speaking out against her own officers. The union was quick to push back, with representatives claiming that Dana was throwing Officer Mathers under the bus to save face. But Dana didn't flinch. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and backlash, but she was prepared. This wasn't just about her. It was about the integrity of the department, about ensuring that what had happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. Officer Mathers was placed on administrative leave pending the results of the internal investigation. As Dana sat in on the review meetings, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. Mathers wasn't a bad cop. He had just acted on the biases that had been ingrained in him, the same biases that affected so many in law enforcement. But that didn't absolve him of responsibility. He needed to be held accountable, just as the department needed to be held accountable for the culture it had allowed to fester. One afternoon, as Dana walked through the precinct, she saw Greg sitting alone in the locker room, his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached, his eyes filled with regret and shame. "Captain," he began, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry. I didn't realize..." Dana held up a hand, stopping him. "Greg, this isn't about you apologizing to me. What happened was wrong, yes. But we need to focus on why it happened and how we can prevent it from happening again." Greg nodded slowly, his face pale. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was following the description." Dana sighed, sitting down across from him. "I know you did, and that's the problem. You didn't stop to question whether the description was enough, whether your instincts were being clouded by bias. That's what we need to fix." Greg looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen." Dana's gaze softened. "I know, Greg, but intent isn't enough. We have to do better. All of us." The protests outside the precinct had started small, just a handful of people holding signs, their voices steady but controlled. They gathered near the entrance, just outside the barricades that had been set up to keep the area secure. It was mostly local activists at first, people who had been involved in community outreach for years, familiar faces to anyone who paid attention to the social justice movements in the city. But it didn't take long for the crowd to grow. By the end of the first day, the small group had swelled into the hundreds, their chants rising in volume and intensity. "Justice for Captain Wells! No more bias policing! Accountability now!" The signs waved in the air, handwritten messages of frustration and demands for change. Dana watched from the second-floor window of the precinct, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions. She appreciated the support, the voices calling for justice not just for her, but for the systemic issues she had long fought to address. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. The protests weren't going to die down anytime soon. If anything, they were going to grow larger, more forceful, as the video of her arrest continued to spread across social media, igniting outrage far beyond the city. By the third day, news trucks lined the streets, reporters with microphones standing in front of the cameras, delivering their reports live. Helicopters hovered overhead, capturing aerial footage of the ever-growing crowd. The protest had caught the attention of national media outlets, and the story had become the latest flashpoint in the ongoing debate over policing in America. And Dana had tried to stay out of the public eye as much as possible, knowing that anything she said or did could escalate the situation. But her face was everywhere. On the news, on social media, even on the protest signs. She had become a symbol, whether she wanted to or not. And with that, the pressure mounted. Inside the precinct, tensions were just as high. Officers were on edge, their usual routines disrupted by the constant presence of protesters just outside their doors. The atmosphere was charged with anxiety and frustration. Some officers felt betrayed, seeing the protests as a direct attack on them. Others understood the anger, but didn't know how to reconcile it with their own sense of duty. Dana had heard the murmurs, the grumblings from some of her colleagues. "This is going too far," one officer had said in the break room, his voice low but bitter. "It's like they think we're all guilty because of one mistake." Another had responded, "It's not just about the mistake. It's about what that mistake represents. We all know there's a problem." Dana hadn't interrupted the conversation. She had simply listened, absorbing the range of emotions and opinions swirling around the precinct. The divide was clear. Some officers were willing to acknowledge the issues, while others were entrenched in defensiveness, unwilling to see the larger picture. It was a microcosm of the wider debate happening in the city and beyond. Later that evening, Dana sat in a conference room with Chief Marshal and several other senior officers. The mood was tense. The chief had been fielding calls all day from the mayor's office, from the police union, from community leaders. Everyone wanted answers, and no one was satisfied. "We need to get ahead of this," Marshall said, his voice tight with stress. "The protests are getting bigger by the day. If we don't handle this right, it's going to turn into a full-blown crisis." One of the senior officers, Captain Thompson, shook his head. "The union's already up in arms. They're accusing us of throwing Mathers under the bus to placate the public. They're threatening to file grievances if we don't back off." Dana clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to speak out immediately. She understood the union's role, but it frustrated her that they were more concerned with protecting one officer than addressing the systemic issues at play. Chief Marshall sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're walking a tightrope here. We have to respond to the public's demands for accountability, but we can't alienate our own officers in the process." Dana finally spoke, her voice measured but firm. "Chief, with all due respect, we can't just focus on keeping everyone happy. This is about more than Officer Mathers. It's about the culture in this department. If we don't confront that head-on, these protests are only going to get louder." Thompson crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "And what exactly are you proposing, Wells? That we start calling all our officers racist? That we throw the entire department under the bus?" Dana met his gaze unflinching. "No one is saying that. But we can't ignore the fact that bias exists, whether we want to admit it or not. We need to start with real reforms, starting with mandatory bias training for all officers. We need to show the public that we're serious about change." Thompson scoffed. "Bias training? That's just lip service. You think a few training sessions are going to fix what's happening out there?" He gestured toward the window, where the sounds of the protest could still be heard faintly. "It's not just about the training," Dana said, her voice calm but insistent. "It's about changing the way we think, the way we approach our jobs. If we don't start somewhere, we're going to keep having these same conversations over and over again." Chief Marshall raised a hand, signaling for calm. "All right, enough. Dana's right about one thing. Doing nothing isn't an option. We have to take real steps, even if they're just the beginning." Thompson leaned back in his chair, clearly unhappy, but not willing to push the issue further. The room fell into a tense silence as Marshall considered the next steps. "I'll draft a statement for the mayor's office," Marshall said finally. "We'll announce the internal investigation into Mathers and the department-wide bias training. We'll also make it clear that we're working with community leaders to address the broader issues." Dana nodded, knowing this was only a small step in the right direction. The protests wouldn't end overnight, and the deep-seated issues wouldn't be solved with a few public statements. But it was a start. As the days went on, the protest continued, gaining momentum with each passing day. Dana found herself in an increasingly difficult position, both inside and outside the department. The media had latched onto her as the face of reform, while the union had grown more hostile, accusing her of undermining the force. She had become a symbol for both sides of the debate, and the weight of that role pressed down on her shoulders. The protesters were relentless, their demands growing more urgent. They called for more than just bias training. They wanted real accountability, real consequences for officers who acted on their prejudices. The chants had shifted from "justice for Captain Wells" to "defund the police" and "end police brutality now." The signs were more pointed, more aggressive. The tension in the air was palpable. Dana watched from her office window as a new wave of protesters arrived, holding banners and signs calling for change. She felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude for the support, frustration with the lack of real progress, and a deep exhaustion that seemed to settle in her bones. Every day was a battle, within the department, with the public, and within herself. It wasn't long before the protests turned more confrontational. One evening, as the sun began to set, a group of protesters clashed with officers near the barricades. What had started as a peaceful demonstration quickly escalated as tensions boiled over. Police in riot gear stood in a line, their batons drawn, while protesters chanted and threw objects over the barricades. Dana rushed outside, her heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. She could see the fear and anger in the faces of both the protesters and the officers. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. "Stand down!" Dana shouted to the officers as she ran toward them. "Do not engage!" The officers hesitated, clearly unsure whether to follow her orders. The tension was thick, and for a moment, it seemed like the situation would spiral out of control. Then, one of the protesters stepped forward, his hands raised. He locked eyes with Dana, his expression intense but not hostile. "We don't want violence," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the crowd. "We want change. We want accountability. Can you give us that?" Dana's chest tightened as she stood there, caught between the two sides, the uniformed officers behind her, and the angry, frustrated crowd in front of her. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure to make everything right. "I hear you," Dana said, her voice strong but weary. "And I'm fighting for that change. But we can't solve this with violence. We need to work together." The protester nodded slowly, lowering his arms. "We'll hold you to that, Captain." Dana turned to the officers, her voice firm. "Stand down, now!" Reluctantly, the officers stepped back, lowering their batons. The tension eased slightly, but Dana knew this was far from over. The protests would continue, the demands would grow louder, and the challenges ahead would only become more difficult. As the crowd slowly began to disperse for the night, Dana stood there, watching them go. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she refused to let it crush her. This was her fight now, her responsibility. And she wouldn't back down, no matter how hard it got. The protests outside the precinct had shown no sign of slowing down. In fact, as the days wore on, they seemed to gain more momentum, more urgency. The voices demanding change grew louder, their presence undeniable. But inside the precinct, a different kind of tension was brewing. Dana walked through the hallways, sensing the unease in the air. Conversations stopped abruptly as she passed, and officers avoided her gaze, their expressions a mix of frustration, confusion, and, in some cases, outright hostility. She had become a polarizing figure within the department. Some officers saw her as a symbol of necessary change, while others viewed her as the reason for the increased scrutiny and the upheaval they were now facing. At the heart of this tension was the reform plan that Dana had been pushing: mandatory bias training, changes to arrest protocols, and the creation of an independent oversight committee to monitor police conduct. These measures were necessary, Dana knew that. But convincing the rank-and-file officers, particularly those who felt under siege from the public and the media, was proving to be a challenge. Dana had already held several meetings with officers in various precincts across the city, trying to explain the importance of these reforms. Some had listened, nodding along, understanding that change was needed. Others, however, had been more resistant. One such meeting was held in the precinct's large briefing room, with over a dozen officers present. Dana stood at the front, her posture composed, but she could feel the tension in the room from the moment she stepped in. The officers sat in their chairs, arms crossed, their faces set in expressions of skepticism. "This bias training," one officer, Detective Carlson, began, his tone sharp. "Is it just another way of saying we're all racist? Because that's what it feels like." Dana took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "No, Detective Carlson, that's not what this is about. Bias is something that affects all of us, consciously or unconsciously. This training is about recognizing those biases and learning how to prevent them from influencing how we do our jobs." Carlson shook his head, clearly unimpressed. "So, we're supposed to believe that the entire department is filled with biased officers, and we're the ones who need to be fixed?" Dana's gaze swept across the room, reading the faces of the other officers. She could see some nodding in agreement with Carlson, while others looked uncomfortable, not wanting to openly confront him, but clearly conflicted about the issue. "It's not about labeling anyone as a bad officer," Dana said, her voice steady. It's about making sure that we're serving our community fairly and equitably. The fact is, the public doesn't trust us right now. We need to earn that trust back, and this is one of the ways we can start. Sergeant Lopez, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the room, spoke up. Captain Wells is right. We can't ignore what's happening out there. People are angry, and they have a right to be. We've all seen the video of her arrest. We've all heard the stories. This isn't about us versus them. It's about making sure we're doing what's right. Carlson rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed with Lopez's defense. Right, because we're the ones at fault for doing our jobs, right? Dana's patience, though well-practiced, was wearing thin. She could feel the defensiveness in the room like a wall she was trying to break through, but she knew this wasn't just about Carlson. His resistance was part of a larger issue, a deep-seated culture within the department that saw any critique as an attack. No one is blaming you for doing your job, Detective, Dana said, her tone firm. But when mistakes are made, when biases influence how we make decisions, those mistakes can have serious consequences. This training is about preventing those mistakes before they happen. It's about ensuring that we're upholding the values we swore to protect when we put on this uniform. Another officer, Officer Jenkins, raised his hand tentatively. Captain Wells, I get what you're saying, but a lot of us feel like this is being forced on us because of what happened with you. Like we're being punished for something that was one officer's mistake. Dana nodded, understanding the sentiment. I know it feels that way, and I wish I could say this was only about my experience. But it's not. My arrest was just one example of a much larger issue. We've seen this happen to civilians across the country, people who don't have the badge or the authority to speak out. This is about preventing that from happening here, in our department. The room fell silent as Dana's words hung in the air. She could see the internal struggle on the officers' faces, the desire to protect their own, to defend the work they had done, but also the creeping realization that something needed to change. Detective Carlson, however, was not convinced. He stood up, his expression hard. You know, Captain, I respect you. I've worked with you for years. But this feels like we're bowing down to public pressure, letting a bunch of people who don't understand what we go through tell us how to do our jobs. Dana's eyes locked onto his, her voice calm but resolute. Carlson, I respect you too. But if we don't address these issues, if we don't acknowledge the ways in which we can improve, we're not doing our jobs right. We're supposed to serve and protect everyone, not just the ones who look like us, not just the ones who fit our idea of what's right. That's the point. The tension in the room was palpable, but Dana could see that her words were starting to sink in with some of the officers. Not all, but some. Sergeant Lopez broke the silence. We're all in this together. The community, the department, all of us. If we don't start working toward that, we're going to tear ourselves apart. Carlson shook his head, his frustration clear, but he didn't say anything more. Instead, he grabbed his notebook and left the room, the door swinging shut behind him. Dana let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She had expected resistance. She had known from the start that this wouldn't be easy. But it was harder than she had anticipated, confronting the deep-seated resistance within her own ranks. Change was never easy, especially in an institution as entrenched as the police force. But it was necessary. And she wasn't about to back down now. Later that day, Dana sat in her office, her eyes scanning the proposal for the independent oversight committee she had been working on for weeks. It was the next crucial step in her reform plan, an external body that would have the authority to investigate complaints of police misconduct, ensuring accountability outside of the internal review process that so often shielded officers from real consequences. The proposal had been met with fierce opposition from the union. They viewed it as an attack on the autonomy of the police, a move that would put officers under the microscope, subject to the whims of people who didn't understand the pressures of law enforcement. But Dana knew that the Oversight Committee was vital. It was the only way to ensure transparency, to rebuild the trust that had been so badly eroded between the department and the community. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Emma. "How are you holding up? Been hearing a lot about the pushback. Call me when you have a minute." Dana smiled faintly, the small bit of warmth cutting through the tension of the day. Emma had been her rock through all of this, always there to listen, to support, even when Dana was too exhausted to talk. She made a mental note to call her later, but right now, there was too much at stake. Just as she was about to return to the proposal, there was a knock on her door. Chief Marshal stepped inside, his face a mix of exhaustion and concern. "Got a minute?" he asked, closing the door behind him. Dana nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "What's going on?" Marshall sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "The union's pushing back hard on the oversight committee. They're threatening to file an injunction if we move forward with it." Dana clenched her jaw. "I expected as much. But this committee is non-negotiable, Chief. If we don't create an independent body, the public is never going to trust us again." "I know," Marshall said, his voice weary, "but they're not seeing it that way. They're seeing it as an attack, as you questioning their integrity." "It's not about questioning their integrity," Dana replied, her frustration seeping into her voice. "It's about making sure there's accountability. We can't keep policing ourselves. It doesn't work." Marshall leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room before landing back on Dana. "You're not wrong, but we've got a long fight ahead of us." Dana nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready." The tension between Dana Wells and the department had been simmering for weeks, but tonight it was about to boil over. The protests outside the precinct had reached a fever pitch. What had started as a peaceful call for justice had turned into a citywide movement demanding sweeping changes to the police force. The streets were filled with protesters holding signs, their chants echoing off the buildings, reverberating through the night air. Inside the precinct, the mood was just as charged. Officers sat in tense silence, watching the protests unfold on the news, hearing the muffled chants through the walls. There was a sense of unease, a fear of what might happen if the crowd outside decided to push through the barricades. The leadership of the department was at a crossroads, and everyone knew it. Dana had been in her office for hours, her phone buzzing with constant updates from the mayor's office, from the media, from community leaders. She was expected to be the voice of calm, the face of reform. But beneath her composed exterior, she could feel the exhaustion setting in. The weight of responsibility bore down on her, and the stakes had never been higher. There was a knock on her door. Sergeant Lopez stepped inside, her face pale, her brow furrowed with concern. "Captain," Lopez began, her voice strained, "we've got a situation. The crowd outside, it's growing by the minute. The barricades won't hold if things get out of control." Dana sighed, rubbing her temples. "How bad is it?" "Bad," Lopez replied. "The mayor's office is getting nervous. They're talking about calling in reinforcements, possibly the National Guard if it gets worse." Dana's heart sank. The last thing they needed was a show of force. Bringing in the National Guard would only escalate tensions, turning what was already a volatile situation into a full-blown crisis. She stood up, pacing the room as she weighed her options. "We can't let that happen," Dana said, her voice firm. "If we bring in the National Guard, we're sending the message that we're at war with our own people. We need to de-escalate, not make things worse." Lopez nodded, but her expression remained grim. "What do you suggest? The crowd's not going anywhere, and the mayor's running out of patience." Dana stopped pacing, her mind racing. She knew what had to be done, but it wasn't going to be easy. The department was on edge, and the officers weren't exactly thrilled with her right now. Many saw her as the reason they were in this mess, the reason they were under a microscope. But if she didn't act, the situation could spiral out of control. "I'm going out there," Dana said, her voice resolute. Lopez's eyes widened. "What? Captain, are you sure that's a good idea? The crowd is angry, and you've been the focus of all this attention. It could be dangerous." Dana met Lopez's gaze, her expression unwavering. "I know it's dangerous, but it's the only way. We need to show the people outside that we're listening, that we're not just hiding behind these walls. If I don't go out there, this could end in violence." Lopez hesitated, clearly torn between her concern for Dana's safety and the gravity of the situation. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Captain, but I'm coming with you." Together, Dana and Lopez made their way to the front of the precinct, passing officers who watched them in silence. Some of the officers gave Dana looks of support, while others remained distant, their expressions hard. Dana could feel the divide, the tension that had been growing within the department since the day of her arrest. As they reached the front doors, Dana could hear the roar of the crowd just outside. The sound was overwhelming, a sea of voices calling for justice, for accountability, for change. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was about to happen. "Stay close," Dana said to Lopez, her voice steady. "But let me do the talking." Lopez nodded, her hand resting on the radio clipped to her belt, ready to call for backup if things went sideways. Dana pushed open the doors and stepped outside. The cool night air hit her like a wave, but it did little to quell the heat of the situation. The crowd, hundreds strong, was gathered just beyond the barricades, their signs held high, their chants growing louder as they saw her approach. "Justice for Captain Wells," they shouted. "No more police brutality." Dana felt a lump form in her throat as she looked out at the faces in the crowd. There was anger there, yes, but also hope. These people believed in her, in the change she had been fighting for, and now they were looking to her for answers. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Listen to me," she called out, raising her hands in a gesture of calm. "Please, just listen." The crowd quieted slightly, the chants dying down as they turned their attention to her. Dana could feel all eyes on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. "I know you're angry," Dana began, her voice strong but measured, "and I know you have every right to be. What happened to me was wrong. What's been happening to people across this country for years is wrong. But violence isn't going to fix this. We need to work together to create real change." There were murmurs in the crowd, and Dana could see some of the protesters nodding in agreement, while others remained skeptical, their arms crossed, their expressions hardened. One of the protesters, a young man with a megaphone, stepped forward. "We've been working together for years, Captain," he shouted, his voice filled with frustration. "And nothing changes. We keep asking for justice, and all we get is more empty promises. When are you going to hold your officers accountable?" Dana's heart ached at his words because she knew there was truth in them. The system had been broken for a long time, and the people in power had often failed to deliver on their promises. But this time had to be different. "I hear you," Dana said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to tell you that I'm committed to holding this department accountable. The reforms we're working on, bias training, changes to arrest protocols, the independent oversight committee, these are real steps toward change. But we need time to make this work." The young man shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "Time? How much more time do you need? We've been waiting for years. My brother was killed by police last year. How much longer do we have to wait for justice?" Dana felt a pang of sorrow, the weight of his loss settling heavily on her. She took a step closer, her gaze locked onto his. "I can't bring your brother back," Dana said, her voice filled with empathy. "And I know that no words I say will make up for what you've lost. But I'm here, standing in front of you, because I believe that we can fix this. I believe that we can create a system where what happened to your brother and what happened to me never happens again." The crowd was silent now, the tension thick in the air. The young man stared at Dana for a long moment, his expression a mix of anger, grief, and something else, something that looked like hope, however faint. "You say that," he said quietly, "but words aren't enough anymore. We need action." Dana nodded, understanding the depth of his pain. "You're right. Words aren't enough. But I promise you this isn't just about words. This is about action. And I'm not going to stop fighting until we get the justice we deserve." For a moment it seemed like time stood still. The crowd was watching, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Dana could feel the weight of their gaze, the burden of their expectations. And then, slowly, the young man lowered his megaphone. He nodded once, a small but significant gesture of acknowledgement. "We'll hold you to that, Captain," he said quietly. Dana exhaled, the tension in her chest easing slightly. She turned back to the crowd, raising her voice once more. "I know you're frustrated. I know you're tired of waiting. But we can't let this turn into violence. We need to keep pushing for change, but we need to do it the right way. I'm asking for your help. Let's work together to make this department, and this city, a place where everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." There was a long pause, the air thick with uncertainty, and then, slowly, one by one, the protesters began to nod, their anger tempered by the hope in Dana's words. "All right," someone called out from the back. "But we're watching you, Wells. Don't let us down." Dana nodded, her heart heavy with the responsibility she had taken on. She knew this was only the beginning. The real work was still ahead. But for now, she had done what she could to keep the peace, to bridge the divide between the department and the community. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Dana turned to Lopez, who had been standing beside her the whole time. "That was close," Lopez said, her voice filled with relief. Dana nodded, the exhaustion hitting her all at once. "Too close." Lopez gave her a small smile, her admiration clear. "You handled that well, Captain. I don't know if anyone else could have done it." Dana gave a tired smile in return. "Let's just hope it's enough." The protests had finally started to calm down, but the work was far from over. The night Dana had faced the crowd had been a pivotal moment, but it was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. As the days turned into weeks, Dana found herself in an exhausting cycle of meetings, negotiations, and strategic planning. The pressure from the community remained strong, and inside the precinct, the resistance to reform still simmered. But there were signs of progress. The first major victory came when the Independent Oversight Committee was officially approved by the City Council. It had been a hard-fought battle, with the police union fighting tooth and nail against it, but in the end, public pressure and Dana's relentless advocacy had won out. The committee would serve as an external body with the authority to investigate complaints of misconduct, providing much-needed transparency and accountability. Dana sat in the council chambers the day the vote was passed, feeling a sense of accomplishment, but also the weight of what still lay ahead. The Oversight Committee was only one piece of the puzzle. The department itself needed to change from within, and that was going to take more than a new policy or a public statement. As Dana walked back into the precinct that afternoon, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. Some were supportive, giving her small nods of approval as she passed. Others were colder, their expressions hard, their resentment palpable. She understood their frustration. Change was hard, and for many of them, it felt like their way of life was being questioned. But Dana knew that this was necessary. The old ways weren't working anymore, and if they didn't evolve, the department would lose what little trust it had left. Inside her office, Dana found a stack of paperwork waiting for her. Proposals, reports, updates from the Oversight Committee, and a formal notice from the police union about their upcoming negotiations. She sighed, rubbing her eyes. The work seemed endless, but she was determined to see it through. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Emma. "Proud of you. Dinner at 7?" Dana smiled, the warmth of the message cutting through the exhaustion that had settled over her. She typed a quick response. "Wouldn't miss it." For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel a small sense of relief. There were still battles to fight, but tonight, at least, she could take a break. In the weeks that followed, the reforms that Dana had fought so hard for began to take root. The bias training program was rolled out across the department, with officers attending mandatory sessions aimed at addressing unconscious biases and promoting fair policing practices. The program had been met with resistance from some officers, but Dana had made it clear that this was non-negotiable. Everyone, from rookies to veterans, was required to participate. Dana made a point of attending several of the training sessions herself, not just as an observer, but as a participant. She knew that leading by example was crucial, especially when so many of her colleagues were skeptical of the changes. During one session, Dana sat with a group of officers as they discussed their own experiences with bias, both within the department and in their personal lives. One officer, Officer Jenkins, who had voiced his concerns about the reforms in earlier meetings, spoke up during the discussion. "I'll be honest," he said, his tone thoughtful but cautious. "When this all started, I wasn't sure how I felt about it. It felt like we were being told we were the problem, and I didn't like that. But sitting here, hearing these stories, I guess I'm starting to see why this is important." Dana nodded, listening intently. "It's not easy to confront these issues, Jenkins, but the fact that you're here, willing to have this conversation, is a step in the right direction." Jenkins nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, I guess I just want to make sure that we're still trusted to do our jobs. I became a cop because I wanted to help people, not hurt them. I don't want to be seen as the enemy." Dana understood his concern. It was a sentiment she had heard from many of her colleagues over the past few weeks. "No one is saying you're the enemy, Jenkins. But we have to recognize that there are things we need to do better. We're public servants. The community needs to trust us, and right now, that trust is broken. This training is one way we can start rebuilding that trust." The conversation continued, with more officers sharing their thoughts and experiences. Some were still resistant, but others, like Jenkins, were starting to come around, seeing the value in the changes Dana was pushing for. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. As the weeks passed, Dana found herself spending more and more time working closely with the Oversight Committee. The committee, made up of community leaders, legal experts, and former law enforcement officials, had been given the task of reviewing complaints of misconduct and making recommendations for disciplinary action. It was a monumental shift in how the department handled accountability, and Dana knew it wouldn't be an easy transition. One afternoon, she sat in a meeting with the committee, discussing one of the first major cases they had been assigned, a complaint against an officer who had used excessive force during a routine traffic stop. The case had been flagged by Internal Affairs, but the Oversight Committee had been brought in to provide an independent review. "This is exactly the kind of case we need to set an example with," one of the committee members, a civil rights lawyer named Marcus Hayes, said. "If we let this slide, we're sending the message that nothing's really changed." Dana nodded in agreement. "We need to be firm on this. The officer's actions were unacceptable, and the public is watching how we handle it." The committee members discussed the details of the case, reviewing body cam footage, witness statements, and the officer's record. It was a meticulous process, but one that was necessary to ensure transparency and fairness. By the end of the meeting, the committee had come to a unanimous decision. The officer would be suspended without pay, pending further investigation, with a recommendation for termination if the allegations were confirmed. It was a strong stance, one that Dana knew would be controversial within the department, but it was the right decision. As the meeting adjourned, Dana lingered in the room, feeling the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. The Oversight Committee was a critical part of rebuilding trust with the community, but it was also a reminder of just how far they still had to go. That evening, Dana sat on the couch at home, the soft glow of the television filling the room. Emma was beside her, their hands intertwined as they watched a documentary, though Dana's mind kept drifting back to the events of the day. "You're quiet tonight," Emma said gently, turning to face her. Dana sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Just thinking about everything. The Oversight Committee, the reforms. It's all so much. I just hope we're doing enough." Emma gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're doing more than enough, Dana. You're making real changes, and that's not easy." But you're doing it. Dana smiled faintly, leaning her head against Emma's shoulder. I just want to make sure that what happened to me, what's happened to so many people, doesn't happen again. It feels like there's so much more to do. Emma kissed the top of her head softly. There's always more to do, but you don't have to do it all at once. You've already made a huge impact. Just take it one step at a time. Dana closed her eyes, letting the comfort of Emma's words wash over her. She knew Emma was right. The road to real reform was long, and there would be setbacks along the way. But for now, they were moving in the right direction. A few days later, Dana was called into a meeting with Chief Marshall. As she stepped into his office, she could sense a shift in the air. Marshall looked up from his desk, his expression thoughtful. Dana, he said, gesturing for her to sit. I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through over the past few months. The protests, the reforms, the oversight committee. You've done an incredible job leading us through this. Dana sat down, her posture straight, but she couldn't quite read where this conversation was headed. Thank you, Chief. But there's still a lot of work to do. Marshall nodded. There is. But I think it's time we start thinking about the future. This department needs strong leadership. Someone who can continue to push for the changes we've started. Someone the community trusts. Dana's heart skipped a beat, realizing where he was going. Chief, Marshall smiled faintly. I'm not saying I'm stepping down tomorrow, but when the time comes, I can't think of anyone better to take the reins than you. Dana felt a mix of emotions, honor, responsibility, and a tinge of fear. She had always been dedicated to her work, but the thought of leading the entire department was overwhelming. I don't know what to say, Dana replied, her voice soft. You don't have to say anything right now, Marshall said, his tone kind. Just think about it. When the time comes, I know you'll be ready. That night, as Dana sat at her desk at home, reviewing reports and planning for the week ahead, she couldn't shake the chief's words from her mind. The idea of leading the department, of taking on that level of responsibility, was daunting. But at the same time, it felt right. She glanced over at a photo on her desk, a picture of her and Emma on vacation, smiling, carefree. It was a reminder of what she was fighting for, not just for herself, but for the people she loved, for the community, and for the future. Dana Wells had faced incredible challenges over the past few months, arrested by her own officers, thrust into the center of a movement, and tasked with leading the charge for reform. But through it all, she had remained steadfast, determined to make the changes she knew were necessary. And now, as she looked toward the future, she knew that her fight was far from over. There would always be more work to do, more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, Dana felt ready. Ready to lead, ready to rebuild, and ready to create a police department that truly served and protected everyone.